Dan. How are you today?
Katie, it's great to see you. I'm looking forward to taking on some more of these questions. We didn't get to nearly as many as I would have liked to in the webinar.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I'm really looking forward to this segment and just getting into more of these questions. So, what do you say we get started?
Let's do it.
Perfect. So, for our first question, we have now that protests are back in vogue, do you see them becoming a mojo story around the Democratic convention?
I think the protests have the potential to create a real problem for Biden and for the Democrats. First of all, even though it's not entirely fair, the historical resonance of the convention taking place this year in Chicago, the same site as the massive disruptions of the 1968 Democratic Convention, are going to be an irresistible angle for the story for the media to cover, which is going to mean that any protests will get even more attention than they would have under normal circumstances. But I also feel that it's almost as irresistible opportunity for the protesters themselves, knowing that the media is going to be there, knowing that, as the protesters said back in the 1960s, knowing that, quote unquote, the whole world is watching. I would be very surprised if we didn't see a very significant turnout on the streets of Chicago and even within the convention hall itself. And the challenge for Biden, even though it's worth remembering that according to public opinion polls, the majority of Americans agree with his approach on the Middle East, the majority of Democrats don't. And seeing him at a convention faced with those types of political challenges could create some real difficulties for him as he looks to jump off into the general election.
Mm. Thanks so much for that. And moving on, what do you think Kennedy's intention is in joining the presidential election, even though the possibility of him winning is very low?
Robert F. Kennedy's candidacy has been absolutely fascinating, and polls show him doing better than any third party candidate since Ross Perot back in the 1992 campaign. So it's been more than 30 years since we've seen this. But my own belief, and there's no way to know because I don't know Kennedy himself, and I don't think you do. Do you, Katie?
No,
Okay,
not
just
yet.
I mean, not yet. Okay, that sounds like a promise. But not knowing him, there's no way to know for sure. But I would not be surprised if he believed that he did have a legitimate chance of winning this election. Um, so I think for those of us who tend to look for ulterior motives with candidates, we may be disappointed here because even though the likelihood of a Kennedy victory is very small, it appears from the way he's conducting himself on the campaign trail that, in his mind at least, that this is not a protest candidacy. The polls don't decisively show that he's helping or hurting Trump or Biden more than the other. So at least at this early stage of the campaign, and this could certainly change by fall, he thinks he's running to win. And we'll see if that maintains as the campaign progresses over the summer and fall.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And for the last question of today's continuing the conversation segment, can the creation of a state of Palestine be decoupled from the violence of Hamas?
That is an extremely difficult question. And to me, it's a question that ultimately leads us to whether there can be peace achieved in the Middle East. Um, as you know by now, Katie, and as our audience knows by now, I do my best not to take sides on these issues. But I have come to believe that even though it's not an ideal solution for all sorts of reasons, that a two-state solution may be the best of a series of less than ideal options available at this point. If you believe that, and you may or you may not, one of the greatest obstacles to that right now is not just the opposition of the Israeli leadership, but of the Israeli people, who understandably since October 7th are very wary about steps such as this one. So that's the question, either for Netanyahu or for his successor. If either of them were to decide to try to convince the Israeli people that a two-state solution was a good idea, is how do you convince them that this is the best protection against further terrorist attack, as opposed to simply inviting it? And Netanyahu himself is politically savvy enough not to attempt that unless he believes he can successfully convince the people of his country. And so that is probably the most important question in this whole debate going forward. Can skeptics of a two-state solution, either in Israel or elsewhere, come to the conclusion that such a step would be in their security interests rather than an additional obstacle to their safety? At this point, we simply don't know.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for expanding on these additional questions. And I know I'm already pretty excited for our June edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report, as I know our audience is as well.
And I really am too. So I will look forward to seeing you, Katie, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you in just a couple of weeks.
Sounds great. Well, have a good rest of your day, Dan.
You too. Thanks again, Katie.